The thing that we're missing there is that blessing is an ending. That's what bloodying means. It means something is bled of its vital force. When I was working in the death trade, this was against the law. Euthanasia was illegal. It was a criminal act, and it happened every day. They positioned themselves as the keeper of the keys of compassion. That was the only working definition of compassion that was itself compassionate. Now, it's extraordinarily challenging to distinguish terminal anxiety from having a bad day, a chronic number of bad days. And I don't mean to make light of people who are suffering, but I am saying categorically that now it's a matter of opinion. The recipe, the solution, the prescription has the germ of the affliction in it, and it's just morphed into another form.
Back on the show today, one of the deepest, most poetic and most profound guests I've ever had. So I definitely wanted him back. He's known for his work in death and dying. Also, is a co-founder of something called the Orphan Wisdom School. And he's got a new book on matrimony out now. So Stephen Jenkinson, welcome.
Thank you.
Let's start with youth. If you see behind me, there's a bunch of flowers, and I found them on a bench today.
All right.
And I thought, I wonder where they're from, because they've just been left there. And I thought they could be from a young man's date that didn't go so well. You know, it could be from a wedding, could be a funeral. I didn't actually know, but I just had an argument with my girlfriend, and I thought, you know what? No one seems to be taking them, so let's take them home. So these flowers are my starting point of thinking, let's go through a little bit of the journey of life. So starting with youth, our culture seems to worship youth, yet a lot of the young people I know are quite unwell mentally. They're quite depressed. Why do you think that is?
Well, they go together, don't they? The first proposition about the worship and the second proposition about disturbance. Sure. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, I don't think we're built to be worshiped. To do some worshiping on occasion, you bet. But to be on the receiving end of that kind of adulation, I mean, ask any, 20-year-old pop star, how's it going so far? And of course, the answer will be most categorically great. But if you just pay attention to the sort of the thinness of the diet that's on offer there where adulation is concerned. So that's a big one. I mean, there's nothing particularly admirable about quote unquote youth in and of itself. I mean, there's not much to be done. If you make it that far, that's where you are. There's a sequence of givens, isn't there? And a lot of it's biochemical, and it doesn't make it cheap. It just makes it unavoidable to a certain extent. And then I don't know about your part of the world. I could say that to be kind, but I have a sense of it. Certainly in my corner of the world, there's no orchestration that gives rise to the formal conclusion of your youth. None whatsoever. You're absolutely on your own to figure out whether or not that indeed is where you are at the end of your youth. Does it feel like an end? Should it? Does it need to be ended, or will it end of its own accord? Is it like every other living thing, striving after a new day, any day, an hour at a time? Or does it look at you one day and say, well, it's been a good run, see ya? I mean, childhood doesn't give way, apparently. There's no reason that adolescence would do so either, I don't think, of its own accord. And so we're in a circumstance in the so-called brave new world of my corner of the earth, at least, where there's so much demeaning of tradition in and of itself. There's so much abandonment of all that came before, disgracing it, dismissing it, feeling disgraced by it, failing in every way that's conceivable to be in a state of regard for those who came before you. And if there's such a thing, I mean, this jumps to the last part of your trajectory for a moment, but if there's such a thing as the dead, not past tense, present tense, if they're really so, do you think there might be any consequence at all for our ongoing historical revisionism way of cutting them loose from the present, from us? Do you think? And do you think those consequences could be in some fashion like a ghastly feedback loop, that the more we disregard them, the less they are able to be on call for us, and so it goes and so it goes? So anyway, long story short then, if you're a young person sort of struggling through the mire of what youth is supposed to be, and can find precious little evidence that it actually is that way, I mean, every day would be some version of trying to figure out, how does this work? And does it work? And am I strictly on the receiving end of what doesn't work, or am I in the making end of it too?
Beautiful. Let's jump around a bit then. The plan's out the window already.
Okay,
Middle age.
heard of it, yeah.
I find myself in middle age almost like it was a surprise. It's crept up on me, 45. And I noticed that perhaps grief is the right word for it. There's a letting go. And I'm not sure I know how to be middle-aged, Stephen.
Mm-hmm.
And one part of me feels like a big kid, maybe the lack of initiation, those kind of things, a cultural issue. What is the grief of middle age? So I tried to speak to people about this, and mostly what came back was this sort of death denial of no, best time of my life. You're still young, Mark. You're in great shape. Sort of, yeah, I still move, and I'm pretty cognizant. I'm not a complete decrepit at 45. But there was a real denial of middle age, and I thought, is that just the denial of death in a sort of earlier form?
Well, it could, I'm sure it's in there. And we're talking, to answer a question like this, is it kind of, the answers are kind of globalish, aren't they? So not very specific and prone to all kinds of overstate. So having said so, um, well, here's the thing. It seems to me that with the kind of debris field carnage that I was just describing to you, it shouldn't surprise, should it, that as we kind of languish or morph imperceptibly from one time of life to another, there are so few markers that actually tell you where you are. You are, forever guessing not only as to the identity of the time you're in, but more importantly, the repertoire. I mean, I remember distinctly, and this was a beautiful recollection now. God bless him, Leonard Cohen, one of my countrymen, in an interview towards the end of his life. He wasn't sick yet, but he was clearly an old man. And the interviewer was all flustered. She was a woman from Norway, all flustered about being, close to him and the ladies' man and all of that, all of that was rising. And he said, she said something to him like, do you have anything hot going? Or so, a kind of basically clueless and graceless kind of question for a man of his age, or any age, but certainly a man of his age. And all he said in response to her was, "It wouldn't be fitting," he said. So he had a sense of fundamental propriety, I think, that served him well in his life and produced the kind of art that those of us who admire him for. How about this one? "I'm tired of choosing desire," he said. "I've been saved by a blessed fatigue. The gates of commitment unwired, and nobody trying to leave." See, if you're looking for signposts, for some kind of guide, that'll do. But the notion is that there's a time frame or a time constraint that comes with every admirable physical and psycho-spiritual gambit you're capable of, including middle age. And middle age is not really a place, is it? It's an in-between place. It's a place of in-between places, you could say. So it's not really the allegation to the youth worship we were talking about earlier is behind you now. You shall not be worshipped any longer. If you ever were, you'll not be found particularly hot by the hotties, right? That goes by the wayside. You walk down the street as an anonymous man, isn't it true?
Yes,
All
yes.
these
Some
kinds
young
of
ladies
things.
walked right by me yesterday, and I had that distinct, what the feminists call invisibility. I was like, oh, okay, I don't exist to them, and maybe that's
That's it.
okay, you know?
That's it. Well, let's go one more Leonard Cohen story, and maybe this concludes the answer to this question. He said, he said, men go through 4 stages or periods in their life vis-a-vis their attractiveness to women. He said the first one is, oh God, wait a minute now, not unavoidable, but irresistible. That's the first one. Someone along the way finds you irresistible. You may never hear that they've done so, but you can be sure at some place along the way you have been found irresistible. And this cannot last, and maybe shouldn't last, but definitely can't last, because it will segue to the second one. And the second one, of course, is resistible. You become resistible to the same people who might have found you irresistible, just a few years ago. This doesn't last either, of course, because it segues surely into ugly. The same people now find you so distinctly unattractive as to border on ugly. But he said, hang on there and hang in there as long as you can, because eventually ugly is going to give way to cute. And that's the ultimate prize, to be found cute by women 1/3 your age. So all of these things, the comedy and the tragedy together suggest we just don't have a very high regard for the passing of time and what it removes from us and what it grants us and would have us understand and would require of us. So most of these failings are cultural, in my estimation, and most of the remedies have to be cultural as well.
I had a haiku moment earlier. I stared into a young woman's eyes, but it was because she was giving me an eye test, and she was actually using her own eyes as part of the test.
Sure.
The sort of haiku-ness of it struck me. Let's talk marriage versus matrimony. Actually, I'd like to read a quote from your book.
Okay.
On what marriage asks of you. Marriage, properly undertaken, is the end of you. That is its purpose. It is not your reward for being in love. It is the beginning of the making of something that 2 of you cannot yet imagine and will never fully see come to pass. That's why it matters. You have a much deeper take on marriage than I think I've ever read before. I wish I'd read it before I got married and now divorced. Why did you choose to write a book called Matrimony?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not sure that I chose to initially. What happened was, and it seemed like a kind of sequence shuffle, like more or less inevitable, that young people had begun to come around the farm here, come around the way of life they imagined was being lived out here, drawn by the books I had written so far and things like that. The school I had going at the time, the Orphan Wisdom School. All of this was kind of a detritus magnet in some ways, and in some ways it drew the deepest longing of people, not young people exclusively at all, but in particular. And from that group, people began to approach me in ones and twos, asking me, apropos of nothing at all, whether I'd do their wedding for them. Now, there's nothing in me that has ever claimed any kind of competence in this regard. But that didn't seem to dissuade them. And so I asked them why. Not why me so much as why they weren't going the route, down the middle of Main Street in this regard with the official, officiant, and the legal steps and so forth. And these are the words that came back to me. We want something that's real. We want something that's authentic. We want something that's true. We want something that's faithful to us and our understanding of life. We want something that works, all of which they found clearly wanting in the off-the-shelf 15-minute affair, right? So I thought about it for a little while, and then my response to them was this: what makes you think that real, authentic, and a lot like you is going to work? What makes you think it's going to get you where you want to get? I mean, I know what all the words mean, but your association with all these things is singularly positive. And really, if it were that simple, wouldn't everybody be doing it? I mean, how many times have you heard people refer fairly disparagingly to a wedding they've been to, which was ultimately the kindest thing you could say? It was kind of a non-event. Just nothing happened. Why? The answer I came up with, partly in anticipation of doing these events and partly from doing them, was that most North Americans, this is the context I'm talking about now, most North Americans came to them as an affirmation of a fait accompli. That was the short-circuiting of the ceremonial alchemy in a phrase. They came to me or to the event in question with the understanding that what the event was for is to obtain a kind of a premature on something that had already taken place, i.e. the love thing. It was simply an affirmation, a kind of a three-dimensional, kind of big fonted declaration of something that was already so. And in actual fact, what these things are supposed to be is alchemical transubstantiations and nothing less. And that's why it was once called the holy state of matrimony, because things were at stake, you see. So long story short, then I began to get a sense of the remarkable poverty that had gathered like iron filings around a magnet around the practice of matrimony, the disparaging of matrimony, the dismissal of matrimony, the clear misapprehension of matrimony. And if that doesn't get a book out of you, you don't have a book in you.
It's been said that romantic love is being asked to fill the hole left by God in modernity, and asked to do the work of the village that has been burnt to the ground, the community that we're kind of meant or evolved to have. It's fair to say that, is that your view, that there's too much put on romantic love?
The wrong kinds of stuff more than too much. The wrong kinds of expectation. We consistently go to the hardware store and demand bread. That's the kind of misapprehension I'm describing. So, for example, my corner of the world again, there's a free fall collapse of the notion of village, principally because we're in the throes of an extraordinary swoon around autonomy, independence, sovereignty, self-determination. And all these things are arrows in the heart of village-mindedness. Village-mindedness is not the opposite of those things. It just doesn't require those things to prevail as we seem to require them to do so. So the best way I could describe it to you in terms matrimonial would be this. I think the principal architecture of matrimony ancestrally was what I've come to call radical hospitality. Now, the word hospitality now has sadly been seconded into like bad restaurant fare and things of that kind. When I say hospitality, remember that it's the root word for hospital, for hospice, for host, for guest. These are all etymologically virtually the same word. And hospitality really means the treatment afforded. Let's say there's two kinds. There's the kind of hospitality that you trot out when your kin or your friends appear. And then you trade on familiarity. Of course you do. And then in so doing, you kind of speak shorthand where hospitality is concerned, because people don't, quote, stand on ceremony in those circumstances, alas, and the rest. There's another kind, and we all intuitively know there's another kind that kind of rises more or less involuntarily when somebody who doesn't share kinship with you appears in your midst, either literally in your house or in your group, standing, somewheres, or in a pub or whatever it is. And that kind of hospitality, if it's not learned and well practiced in the culture, turns into a subtle war on strangerhood. Okay? In other words, what it's trying to do is reduce the strangeness of the stranger until the stranger is just another person that you know. And you try to get there as quickly as possible. And the Americans are famous for this, are they not? I mean, they love that aphorism from whatever that fellow was, somebody Smith or something. He said, "There's no strangers, there's only friends I haven't met yet." I mean, it ain't true. But more importantly, it's not supposed to be true. So let me add the final point on this thing then. I submit to you that the best part of a culture is manifest in the presence of a stranger. What a stranger does is oblige the culture to speak longhand, not shorthand, where the elegance of its understandings of its own practice, tribal practices, clan practices, and the rest enjoy their sort of fullest expression. That's what matrimony is the place where strangers are afforded their strangerhood, such that the best part of the rest of us can come forward and treat them accordingly. And when you subvert all of that and turn matrimony into a celebration of what already exists, then you're obliging the strangers to sort of be on the outside looking in of a kind of in-group event, a kind of centripetal event where everything is drawn to the middle. And in that sense, an awful lot like all the deaths I saw when I work in the death trade. You could call it the current regime privatized love.
As opposed to love being situated in community?
As opposed to a love which is supposed to benefit the community.
Mm-hmm. So marriage is as much for the community as for the individuals?
Oh, more so.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, more so. Marriage understood in the terms we're talking now, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
That's a heavy qualification. But marriage in that sense, its fundamental work is to find ways in the intermediate part of life to help us forgive the ebbing of excitement, the ebbing of addiction to novelty, all the stuff that's hit full and hit hard by the time most people are your age, and turn into something that looks life affirming instead of life pirating.
Mm. You talked a lot about the stranger there. It seems like there's something going on in culture in North America, Canada, US, and a lot of Europe around the relationship to the stranger. For a long time, it seemed like people have said there's no such thing as the stranger because there's no community, right? There's no real belonging. So there's no strangers. And sometimes with the best of intentions of sort of borderlessness or sort of post World War II kind of trying to go in the absolute opposite direction of Hitler, kind of almost like a counter shadow to that huge shadow. And now I see people asserting, for example, that the English exist, for example, for the first time. I haven't heard that in most of my life. That was a taboo topic until very recently.
Yeah.
and even relatively sort of middle of the road people talking, having issues with mass migration. And do we share values? Can there be community with people who are in a multicultural society, or a non-cultural society, perhaps is a better way of saying it? Can there be community? I'm in Slovenia right now, which is very Slovenian, and they value that because the Yugoslav civil war that happened didn't happen so much here because they were very Slovenian. There wasn't, Bosnians and Serbs and Croats kind of fighting and killing each other. So they very much value their sense of Slovenianness. And I'm an outsider here, so I've experienced this being in migrant areas of the UK. Like when I lived in Leeds, for example, I was in a predominantly Pakistani migrant area, and now I experience it as a migrant. The sense of otherness, the subtle dysregulation of that, the subtle, not even if I'm using my Slovenian or people speak good English, there's a subtle otherness there. Something shifting in the world around this. Thoughts on that?
Well, like I should say, I don't pant after the news. I seem to be occupied otherwise, but it doesn't utterly disqualify me. I mean, to weigh in here a little bit, just with that qualifier. This is a very tricky business, obviously. Here's why. I didn't say that everybody's good at it. The advocacy I was making for radical hospitality. I didn't say that the inevitable consequence of trying to do so is doing so. Don't forget, if the culture in question is profoundly out of practice with being itself, or the point that you made about English earlier, if the degree of kind of psychic and philosophical shame that's been meted out in the educational system, in the broadcasting world and beyond, that's allegedly tantamount to having a historical conscience. When that stuff goes on, as it's been going on for some considerable period of time, be not surprised that it just goes like this. It's just a pendulum. There's a certain generation will take so many shit sandwiches from you, and then it'll flip. Virtually, it would appear overnight and turn into a sort of arch conservative is not having it anymore kind of thing, right? So when you think you're on the right hand of history, that's the time to take it easy. That's not the time to grind away at the bad guys on the other side of the chasm, because of the swing, you see. And you've described it very well. I think that's what's going on indeed, is a kind of wicked pendulum that allows for no intermediacy, no hesitation about response, right? One. Two, the democracies that we're alluding to here in this conversation are what I've come to call flabby democracies for the most part. That means their democratic institutions and their exercise of those things hasn't seen a lot of tutelage, hasn't seen a lot of exploration or pressure or self-induced challenges. And so we've kind of had a fairly good go of it in many corners of this kind of the world, basically since World War II. There's a lot of other places in the world that haven't, but I'm in a corner of the world that's done, quote unquote, fairly well. And those days are probably coming to an end, are beginning to end already. So, of course, there are strangers. I mean, it behooves recently immigrated people to recognize that they've moved, that they're not in the place that they left, that there's no merit in constantly comparing the homeland that you left with the immigrant experience that you are entertaining now. I mean, what did you think was going to happen, right? And is it all, quote, economic immigration or economic refugees, and so on. So now this goes, in all kinds of directions. I just don't have the energy or the time to try to explore right now. But I would just conclude by saying, as I said a minute ago, of course there are strangers. The strangers have no obligation to resemble me. we do have an obligation to recognize that being after a fashion in the same place will likely produce in a couple of generations a not very subtle shift in what our understanding is of, in my case, what it means to be a Canadian, which is a kind of confabulation, really. There's no naturally occurring event called Canadian. Canadian is very young, right, isn't it? And it's very, very legislated. And the best thing that ever happens to Canadianism is the advent of a thing like Trump. It's the best thing for our country in terms of radical self-definition.
Because he said you don't exist and he's going to invade you. Was that it? That made
Well, that's part of it.
Assert a Canadianness.
Certainly that's part of it. But the rest of it is we look at him and his ilk and we say, well, whatever we may be, we ain't that. And assiduously go about not being that. So one of our self-definition strategies is how un-American we can be.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the defining oneself as different. Okay, let's link marriage and death. So I believe you argue that matrimony or true matrimony requires a willingness to let parts of you die. That there's the role of grief and sorrow, perhaps as ever, in matrimony. What's the link there?
Well, matrimony is a blessing. But then you got to do a little etymology about the word blessing, and then you feel something that you're not likely to feel otherwise. And the word blessing and the word blood are joined at the hip. So if we were to turn blood into a verb, we would call it bloody, bloodying. And essentially, blessing is a kind of bloodying. How so? Well, we mistake it for approval, blessing, but that's not what it is. When a young person comes to you asking for your blessing on their marriage, their yet to be marriage, they're probably asking you just to say yes to it, just to favor it and kind of festoon it with your affirmation, things like that. What happens to the critical apparatus if that's all it is? What happens to the assessment branch of your discernment if that's all it is? And if it's your kid, is the only function available to you to see your kid's probable spouse in the same way that your kid sees the spouse? Is that it? Is that your repertoire? Are you a kind of hand-in puppet yes man? Well, generally speaking, if you don't wonder about what blessing is for, yes, that's exactly what you become. A kind of Greek chorus of one. Interestingly enough, your approval is highly esteemed, but any other sound you might make is not. When you start thinking about the dynamics of the thing, you should be arrested a little bit by that. So the thing that we're missing there is that blessing is an ending. That's what bloodying means. It means something is bled of its vital force. Things are not what they were. And this is why in quote unquote traditional cultures the world over, people dress differently from the day of their wedding on out, right? You can tell a married person from a long way off because they self-designate accordingly. And the old repertoire, including the old wardrobe, is unbecoming, to use Leonard's word. It's unbecoming, no? And so our notion that we don't look our age would be anathema in a place like that. We use that as a kind of affirmation. You don't look your age at all. Well, whose age do I look then? And, everyone's thrown off. And from behind, you can't tell, is that grandpa or is that dad? Right? In the mall. You can't tell anymore because, Lululemon has it that way. Everybody more or less dressed in the same. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that there's a kind of robust, requisite sorrow that should be part and parcel of, quote, moving on. When you say yes to someone matrimonially, it's a fact that you're saying a virtual no to every other somebody, every other possibility, every other attunement of happiness that could have been otherwise available to you. I could just go on and on with the stuff that's gone, but you get the point. So at the level of endings, for every allegation that this is the beginning of the rest of your life, there's evidence galore that there's a lot of endings now that are requisite for anything, quote, called the rest of your life to ensue. So it belongs. And this is why in my corner of the world, there was part of the legal code of the event was someone in a position of authority was obliged to say, if there's anyone here who knows any reason why this should not proceed, speak now or forever hold your peace, or words to that effect. What was going on there? Well, one of the things that was going on is that the elders were invited to weigh in to counteract this whole kind of gravitational force field of affirmation and good feelings and love, love, love is all you need and all of that gear, and give voice to the fact that these people are claiming in their vows to be ready and capable and willing to do something that they've never done, called those vows. And are we to orchestrate our entire subsequent existence after today on the off chance that they're right about that? I mean, just for starters, the elder voice in this circumstance would be not a contrarian voice. It would just be the rest of the story showing up. The one that's banished by the feel-good army.
Could have one of the Israelis got the 12th man who always objects and says, no, this is a terrible idea when 11 people go along with something. And I guess there is that little bit of the sense of the grief of a marriage from the best man sometimes, like, John's no longer one of the boys, he's been taken, there is there's some small.
Well, it would be better if the grief didn't have bravado and backslapping attached to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
If there was genuine sorrow. Listen, I'll give you an example from one of the weddings I did. So most of the wedding, and my weddings, the weddings I've done, I should say, are hours long, like hours and hours long. Why? Because everybody speaks. What do you mean? They just say amen or yes or no? No. I'm talking about testifying. So at one point in the proceedings, the ex-girlfriend of the prospective groom stood up. Not everybody knew who she was, but in 5 seconds they did. So that's how she's self-identified. And she didn't speak about him. She spoke to him. And she said the equivalent of, I know you. I know how you are with women. I know how you are when you're unsure of yourself. And those three things together are a wicked combination. So I'm here to hold you to account. And then she went on, but what his obligation to this woman he was proposing to marry was. And as she was doing this, I don't know if you can imagine or feel it in your bones as I tell you the story, but this man's mother, I mean, it was going to be a wicked fight if it was left to just let her rip, I mean, it was very, very strong stuff. There's nothing sort of theatrical in the false sense of the term about it at all. This is grief speaking, you see. I know it sounds a little aggressive, and it was in its way, but she took the moment at face value, and she assumed that her time in with him had merit that was called upon now. And she risked an awful lot, to her credit, to do such a thing in an event that's supposed to be allegedly and intolerantly happy.
Yeah, I'm not sure I believe in arranged marriages, but I think we should definitely have sponsors. I think I was talking to my friend Tad Hargrave around this, who I think you know, and may be influenced by you. And we were saying, wouldn't it have been a good idea before I got married if a whole bunch of people who knew us both well had got together and actually discussed if it was a good, rather than, hey, your kids are in love. That's great. Go do your thing. When's the date? If they'd have got together and said, do we actually think you guys are going to be good for each other underneath the hormones and the excitement of it all? Like, does the village agree and support this fully? Maybe with dissenting voices. Can see the sense in that.
Well, now you're talking about the ages old sort of subliminal architecture of the wedding ceremony proper. The whole orchestration, which most of which has been lost to us in modernity, but the whole orchestration is to serve the yabat, not to enthrone it any more than the amen is supposed to be enthroned, just to make lots of room for the rest of the story that, as I said a minute ago, the intolerance of amen tends to banish. And that's what the people in question deserve from the rest of us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Not have to tolerate from the rest of us, deserve from the rest of us. That's what, quote, witnesses are supposed to be. It's not witness to a car accident we're talking about. Witness is something you bear, right? That's the proper verb for you bear witness to something. And if these people in time to come can't remember what they said, what they vowed they would do and so forth, guess how they might be reminded? By their witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one thing to be called upon to do the reminding. It's another thing entirely for the witnesses years down the road to take it upon themselves to be those witnesses still and to come to the house and say, listen, you asked me by virtue of inviting me to your event to be this person now, years later. And that's the person I vowed to you I would be, and here I am being that person. That kind of thing is, I mean, it sounds, God, well, nervy, doesn't it? It sounds a lot of things. It sounds uncalled for because it is uncalled for. But God, is it ever needed though?
Oh yeah. When my ex-wife and I started having problems, I now realized there was not one person who came to our house who was at the wedding and said, hey, remember you guys, this is what you said and this is why. And mostly just because of geography and the death of the village. Um, hard to fly from Ukraine these days. I'm also wondering about divorce. I got divorced by clicking an online form the government sent me,
Right.
and amicably, but I've been realizing like there's not much of a ritual to click an email. And happily, I've been called into court by a judge around the financial settlement. Again, all very good natured, but at least there's a day in court. And I realized ahead of this interview, like, oh, we've had no divorce ritual. Is that a thing? Is that something that people do?
Not that I've heard. The divorce ritual is the going into penury. Is that the word? Yes. Going into penury by having to pay your lawyer. That's the ritual. Again, to use your phrase, not really a ritual.
Mm.
In fact, not a ritual at all, clearly. This is a ersatz ritual, isn't it? Or your friends taking you out and turning you out, so to speak, back into the game, so to speak. That kind of shit is none of that is ritualistic. It's all surrogate ritual. It's all self-penned anti-vows, right? Or the vows of undoing. It's just more poverty. And this arrangement, the legal part of it, should be a lot harder to get into
Right. I was
and a lot
surprised.
easier to get out of.
Yeah. Yeah.
In other
Mm.
words, you really got to earn your way in. It seems to me to be the sane and adult way of understanding this. That you really got to, it's labor to enter that precinct, that holy state, so-called.
Mm.
And the exit from it is, I mean, the consequences are already with you. Sorry, that's my phone ringing. I forgot to unplug it. It'll unring in 5. So, yeah, sad but true that we kind of tend to take the coward's way out of a lot of things. And self-penned rituals are no braver than no rituals at all.
Mm. Let's talk about death. Entrance point into this. The UK just passed an assisted dying bill.
Right.
Um,
I was there when it happened.
in the UK.
I was in
Uh-huh.
Wales.
And I know Canada has had this for some time.
Yeah, that's right.
I've heard quite a lot of disturbing stories, to be honest, coming out of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on this?
Well, there's a lot of things to say. There's a lot of things to feel. If you join the two of them together, you could be at it all day. I would say this about it, though, to add to maybe an unlikely voice. When I was working in the death trade, this was against the law. Euthanasia was illegal. It was a criminal act. And it happened every day. We didn't talk about it. We weren't bellicose in that way. But internally, we knew that we were engaged in a kind of passive euthanasia, that it wasn't routine at all. But it didn't lean on the law. It leaned on a question of conscience instead. And you know, Dylan's great line, "To live outside the law, you must be honest," is really useful here. So what happened was the advocates for assisted dying at the time were claiming basically that this was an act of compassion. No surprise. Not only that, but they positioned themselves as the keeper of the keys of compassion. That was the only working definition of compassion that was itself compassionate. That there's such a thing as enough already, which is true.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you from being there is such a thing as enough already. I will also say, to go along with that, discernment of that moment is not self-evident. You will not necessarily know that you are there when you are there. Okay, so that's a big qualifier for the notion that all you have to do is decide, and that's the magic bullet, and then get a couple of physicians who agree with you and get the prescription. So they would say in the early days that the reason their compassion rules the day is that it's the safeguard is it's associated with death, with the oncomingness of death anyway. You're dying anyhow. This measure, yes, hastens the dying, but sublimates the suffering. Let's put it that way. I knew what was going to happen if they passed it. It doesn't make me a genius. It was obvious what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
What they were going to do in phase 2 of the rollout was to simply soften and then to suspend altogether the reliance that euthanasia had to be associated with the fact that you were dying anyway. And quietly, that's what's begun to happen. The practice
Just for
now.
listeners who might not know, do you want to share a little bit about what has begun to happen?
Yeah, sure. The practice is that you no longer have to have a terminal diagnosis to qualify for active euthanasia. What you have to have is a kind of intractable suffering that you can persuade others of the merit of. That's not very hard to do, I have to say. You can have so now it's extraordinarily challenging to distinguish terminal anxiety from having a bad day, a chronic number of bad days. And I don't mean to make light of people who are suffering, okay? But I am saying categorically that now it's a matter of opinion. That's all it is. And of course, its advocates will say, who are you to stand in a position of interfering with someone's self-soothing? My response would be to say, do you know the consequences of this activity are almost across the board cultural and uncontainable. And you can see the moment, can you not, coming? When family members will threaten their families with self-induced euthanasia if they don't straighten up, if they don't treat them better, if you can see it'll be part of the repertoire of family mishigas.
Yeah, and a certain amount of pressure being applied. It's very expensive to keep someone alive in the later stages of their life.
That's right.
People making permanent decisions from temporary moods. I mean, I've certainly had black periods in my life where I felt like there was no point living and could have convinced someone else with my articulateness that my suffering was never ending. And then a year or two later, it was okay. I'm glad there was no one there with a government form. As I understand it, it's one of the largest causes of death in Canada, right? It's like fourth or fifth in the,
That I don't know.
yeah.
But I'll say this to you, that Canada was a death-phobic culture prior to the passing of this bill into law. It remains a death-phobic culture. In other words, what it was supposed to do, humanizing death, if you want to say that term, has not happened and was never going to happen. This was a death bypass bill. Oh yes, I know people at the end are dead in both examples I'm talking about. But in the self-induced example, people didn't have to die. They decease. The understanding of dying being it's a prolonged in-time affair, which requires and asks, yes, a tremendous amount, not only of you, the dying person, but of the people around you. Certainly it does. But where's it written that that's not supposed to be that way? That it's, quote, hard enough as it is without being hard. I mean, it's a strange formulation, but that's what's in there. So the culture, the death-phobic culture writes a prescription for its death phobia called medical assistance in dying. Do you hear what I'm saying? The recipe, the solution, the prescription has the germ of the affliction in it. And it's just morphed into another form, a more sort of vaguely socially acceptable form. Not socially considered, just socially acceptable.
Last question. You're in your latter years. I've heard you on another podcast say you have some, I think it was something, tell me if I'm wrong, it was something like a serious diagnosis or some serious challenges by the sounds of things.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who's considered, in air quotes, an expert on death, how is that as you face your own death, or at least the last years of your life?
Are you asking me whether or not all this time in with the death of other people somehow is cashing in nicely now?
I wouldn't ask such a crude question. I am curious how those two things meet. I haven't got a good question here, Stephen. Help me out.
Well, they don't meet necessarily. This is the problem with expertise. Expertise is a kind of silo, sadly. And it's not the best way. The best way is a democratization of wisdom. That's the best way, it seems to me. And that's what I've tried to do over the years. And I will say, to go along with that there comes a time, I'm very persuaded of this now, when your stance, the public stance that you've been lucky enough to be able to assume, and if you are to be able to be articulate about it, has to give way, because that's not where in your life you are. That's not your work now. And the discernment of how your work has changed, even though the subject seems to be a transferable subject, is a huge challenge. Who am I now that this is so is a real question. It's not an exercise. And if you have a public life, as I've had, one of the obligations you have is to seriously wonder whether or not the public life needs to continue to be fed as it once was. by the same kinds of material and reflections and so on as you once did? Or is there a certain degree of coming to, well, they use the term a come to Jesus time, right? It's a kind of come to Jesus time where you gotta wonder about your old repertoire, your old skillfulnesses, whether they are in for the long haul with you, whether they belong now. What does it look like to love being alive when life doesn't look the same as it once did the last time you said that? There.
Stephen Jenkinson, thank you very much.
Thank you.